Deep beneath the marble corridors of Washington, D.C., inside the cavernous vaults of the Library of Congress, sits a forgotten filing cabinet containing the voices of the dead. Not audio recordings, but thousands of pages of typewritten ghosts. Between 1936 and 1940, the Federal Writers Project sent out-of-work journalists into the homes of ordinary citizens across 24 states. Their mandate was simple: capture the oral histories of America's oldest living generation before they faded away forever. The writers gathered nearly 3,000 life stories, boxed them away, and left them essentially untouched for decades. Mainstream history views these transcripts as quaint pioneer tales, offering a charming look at the steady march of the American frontier. But alternative researchers who have begun digging into these archives suggest a far more unsettling narrative might be hiding between the lines. Proponents of this theory point to a persistent anomaly hiding in plain sight in almost every American city: the sprawling courthouses and government buildings supposedly erected in the mid to late 1800s. According to the official historical timeline, struggling settlers armed with little more than rudimentary hand tools and horse-drawn wagons managed to build massive, neoclassical structures featuring impossibly heavy stone blocks and towering ceilings. But when you look closely at the architectural proportions of these 19th century monoliths, an unsettling pattern emerges. The doorways are cavernous, the stone steps are awkwardly steep, and the massive brass doorknobs sit unnaturally high for the average citizen of the era. Mainstream historians confidently explain this away as a mere homage to grand European antiquity, a deliberate stylistic choice meant to project civic power. However, those who look at these structures through the lens of alternative history ask a mind-bending question: what if these impossibly grand buildings were not constructed by the people of the 1800s, but were simply found and inherited by them? This is precisely why those Depression-era interviews are so critical. Consider the undeniable math of the human lifespan. A person who was 85 years old when the government writers knocked on their door in 1938 would have been born in 1853. They were wide-eyed children during the most dramatic, chaotic, and poorly documented transitional period in modern American history. They lived, breathed, and remembered an era just before everything supposedly changed. And what these elderly citizens remembered presents a chilling discrepancy. They spoke of an environment that simply does not fit the rigid, sterile boundaries of our modern textbooks. If the official history we are taught is the unquestionable truth, then why do the whispered memories of this lost generation seem to describe an entirely different realm? What exactly did these elderly witnesses see in their childhoods that the history books had already decided to erase? Every American schoolchild is taught the legend of October 8, 1871. Mainstream history tells us a simple, almost comforting tale of a clumsy cow in a barn, a densely packed wooden city, and the tragic anomaly of the Great Chicago Fire. We are taught that a disastrous combination of severe seasonal drought, accumulated logging debris, and an intense cold front whipped stray sparks into an uncontrollable inferno. But alternative researchers and historical anomalies investigators point to a terrifying detail that the standard curriculum conveniently glosses over. On that exact same night, at the exact same hour, apocalyptic firestorms erupted simultaneously across 3 different states. This was not a single city catching fire by accident. This was an entire region of the American Midwest, seemingly igniting from the sky down. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a firestorm of unimaginable ferocity consumed the entire town in roughly 60 minutes, claiming over 2,000 lives in what remains the deadliest wildfire in recorded American history. Concurrently, across Lake Michigan, the towns of Holland, Manistee, and Port Huron were violently engulfed in flames. When you dive into the first-hand accounts from survivors, their chilling descriptions completely defy conventional wildfire behavior. Eyewitnesses documented winds powerful enough to lift grown adults off the ground and heat so utterly intense that people fleeing across open, unburned fields simply burst into flames without ever being touched by a visible spark. The parish priest of Peshtigo, Reverend Peter Pernin, who survived only by submerging himself neck-deep in a freezing river, published his harrowing account 3 years later. He described a localized phenomenon where the available oxygen was consumed so rapidly that victims showing absolutely no external burn marks were found asphyxiated in the streets, as if the very air itself had been weaponized. Official meteorologists steadfastly maintain that these simultaneous infernos were simply the result of a perfectly terrible storm system colliding with dangerously dry terrain. Yet, the sheer simultaneity of these events across 2.5 million acres has gnawed at independent investigators for over a century. In 1883, a controversial hypothesis emerged suggesting that highly combustible fragments of a dying celestial body known as Biela's comet had struck the atmosphere, raining unnatural fire from above. This alternative theory gains eerie traction when you read the forgotten reports of survivors in Chicago who witnessed bizarre, blue flames burning in their base Mensa chemical combustion signature that simply does not match burning wood. While mainstream science rejects the comet theory as sensationalism, it has never been entirely disproven. The mathematical impossibility of such simultaneous, hyper-destructive combustion leaves a haunting void in the official narrative. If the children who miraculously survived that night grew up to tell their stories to the government writers of the 1930s, exactly what did they say fell from the sky, and why were their testimonies quietly locked away? Imagine a ledger containing the secrets of an entire vanishing world. In 1890, the United States government conducted the most comprehensive and deeply intrusive census in its history up to that point. For the first time, every single family received a dedicated, multi-page form. It documented over 62 million Americans with unprecedented precision, tracking everything from naturalization details to their ability to speak English. Mainstream history frames what happened next as nothing more than a tragic sequence of bureaucratic accidents and terrible luck. Alternative researchers, however, look at the timeline of the 1890 census and see the meticulous, deliberate erasure of an entire generation. The mystery deepens when you consider the sudden break in a century of established protocol. From 1790 to 1880, every previous census had local backups securely stored in county courthouses and state archives across the country. Yet, for this singular, highly detailed snapshot of the American populace, the government mandated that the 1890 census exist in only one location, the dimly lit basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. According to the official record, on the afternoon of January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in that very basement. The subsequent investigations never determined a definitive cause, floating theories that range from a carelessly discarded cigarette to the spontaneous combustion of sawdust in an adjacent workshop. Approximately 25% of these irreplaceable records were incinerated outright, while another 50% suffered severe water and smoke damage. While a basement fire is a plausible historical tragedy, what occurred over the next decade is far more disturbing to those who question the narrative. The surviving documents, millions of them, still perfectly usable, were quietly moved to a warehouse where they sat neglected for 12 years. No massive restoration effort was launched. No immediate attempts were made to copy the fading ink. Then, in December 1932, the chief clerk of the Bureau of the Census sent a list of documents scheduled for routine destruction to the Librarian of Congress. The 1890 census was on that list. When asked if any of these records were worth preserving for historical purposes, the librarian concluded they were not. Congress officially authorized their destruction on February 21, 1933. Here is the detail that sends a shiver down the spine of any historical investigator. The very next day, February 22nd, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building a state-of-the-art, fireproof facility specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of loss. The government legally destroyed the surviving records of 62 million Americans just one day before initiating the construction of the building that would have saved them. Out of that massive registry, roughly 6,000 names survived the purge. Why was the single most detailed record of the exact generation that lived through the transition period systematically eliminated? And what identities were they trying to bury in the ashes? Between the years of 1854 and 1929, the rhythmic clashing of iron wheels against steel tracks carried a deeply unsettling cargo across the sprawling American landscape. An estimated 250,000 children were loaded onto westbound trains in East Coast cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, destined for the vast, unfolding horizons of the rural Midwest. Mainstream historians gently frame the Orphan Train movement as a noble, pioneering, charitable endeavor. According to the official narrative, organizations like the Children's Aid Society were desperately trying to rescue impoverished youths from the squalor and disease of overflowing urban slums, offering them a fresh start in the wholesome countryside. But when alternative researchers peer through the fog of this sentimental history, they see the chilling mechanics of an entirely different agenda. The reality on the ground was far more transactional than charitable. At various whistle stops along the route, weary and disoriented children were paraded onto wooden train platforms and displayed in what contemporary eyewitness accounts described as auction-like events. Local farming families would step forward to inspect the youths, practically evaluating their physical size, apparent stamina, and capacity for hard agricultural labor before selecting the ones they wanted to take home to the fields. Yet, the darkest secret of this massive relocation effort is that less than half of these passengers were actual orphans. The vast majority were simply the children of the poor, the displaced, or immigrants who lacked the societal power to fight the sweeping institutions taking their offspring. Proponents of alternative history point out a deeply disturbing detail that is almost entirely omitted from standard textbooks. Upon arrival in their new communities, these children were systematically stripped of their pasts. Older children were strongly encouraged, and in many cases strictly required, to break all contact with their previous lives. Birth names were arbitrarily changed. Family origins were either intentionally ignored or recorded with glaring inaccuracies. The organizations orchestrating this monumental shift kept remarkably fragmented and spotty records, effectively ensuring that the trail back home vanished into thin air. By the time these children grew into adults, many could not tell their own grandchildren where they genuinely came from because the truth had been institutionalized out of them. 250,000 Americans had their identities functionally severed by design. This massive relocation perfectly mirrors the exact timeline of the Great Fires and the impossible architecture of the late 19th century. If a hidden hand were attempting to quietly repopulate a newly inherited, oversized world, wouldn't their first logistical step be to manufacture a massive generation of workers who had absolutely no memory of what came before? If the fiery erasure of historical records and the strategic relocation of 250,000 children form the foundation of this mystery, then the year 1893 presents the architectural smoking gun that they desperately do not want you to examine too closely. Enter the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, historically immortalized as the White City. Over the course of 6 spectacular months, 27 million wide-eyed visitors wandered through a sprawling utopia of over 200 breathtaking buildings covering 630 acres of Jackson Park. Mainstream historians present this achievement as a triumph of American ingenuity and temporary engineering. We are taught that these massive neoclassical structures, featuring enormous domes rivaling the grandest European cathedrals, towering fluted columns, and sculptural details as precise as ancient Rome, were hastily slapped together in under 2 years. The official story claims this was all done using a crude mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, and jute fiber spread over wooden frames by laborers using nothing but hand tools and horse-drawn equipment. Proponents of alternative history However, look at the sheer scale of the White City and point out the staggering logistical impossibilities. No diesel cranes, no modern bulldozers, no advanced construction technology, yet 200 monumental buildings of impossible grandeur were supposedly erected in under 24 months. But the true mystery deepens not with the construction, but with the immediate, almost frantic destruction that followed. After a mere 6 months of glorious display, nearly every single magnificent structure was aggressively demolished, dismantled, or mysteriously burned to the ground. The only major building permitted to survive was the Palace of Fine Arts, preserved simply because it had been heavily fireproofed to protect the priceless collections inside. Everything else was wiped from the face of the earth. This bizarre sequence of events was not an isolated anomaly. The exact same pattern repeated with eerie consistency at other massive global exhibitions. Paris in 1889, Buffalo in 1901, St. Louis in 1904, and San Francisco in 1915. Build magnificent, sprawling complexes of impossible scale and meticulous detail, display them to the awestruck masses for a fraction of a year, and then destroy them completely and utterly every single time. Those elderly Americans, interviewed by the government writers in the 1930s, vividly remembered walking through the White City. They walked beneath those towering archways and saw something that looked absolutely nothing like the rudimentary, muddy America being constructed around them. They witnessed a realm that felt profoundly older, infinitely grander, and eerily permanent. When those children of the 1890s grew old, did they remember visiting a temporary plaster exhibition, or did their silenced memories actually hold the fading image of an ancient, inherited city that was always there, just waiting to be erased? Imagine a woman in the early 1950s, sitting quietly on a sunlit porch, surrounded by the energetic hum of post-war America. Born in the late 1850s, she lived long enough to witness the dawn of the television age, but her mind held the impossible, fading memories of an entirely different realm. She remembered a world where the sprawling civic buildings felt ancient, impossibly grand, and scaled for inhabitants of a completely different proportion. She remembered the terrifying night the sky turned a chemical blue across 3 Midwestern states, and the endless iron trains carrying thousands of children with intentionally severed identities. But when she tried to pass these memories down to her grandchildren, to speak of a reality that completely defied the shiny new world being built around them, her family simply smiled politely and changed the subject. In the mid-20th century, the newly printed textbook was absolute law, and the fragile, spoken truth of the old world was comfortably dismissed as the wandering imagination of the elderly. When you step back and examine the timeline, proponents of alternative history argue that these isolated anomalies coalesce into a chilling, inescapable pattern. Between the 1850s and the 1870s, impossibly advanced neoclassical architecture suddenly populates a rugged, horse-drawn frontier. In 1871, simultaneous, unexplainable firestorms obliterate entire regions in a single night. In 1890, the government captures the most detailed demographic snapshot of the surviving transition generation, only to systematically neglect and eventually authorize the destruction of those exact records by 1933. The dazzling, ancient-looking White City of Chicago is erected in 1893, displayed briefly, and then ruthlessly demolished. All the while, 250,000 nameless children are distributed across the continent. By the time the Federal Writers Project scrambled to interview the last living witnesses in 1936, the window was already rapidly closing. Just 3 years later, the project was abruptly defunded, and the remaining transcripts were boxed up and buried in a government vault. The human chain linking us to that forgotten era is now irreparably broken. The last Americans who saw the old world with their own eyes have passed on, and their grandchildren who once half listened to those unbelievable tales are now fading away themselves. But the evidence hasn't completely vanished into the ether. Those 2,900 transcribed testimonies still exist, resting in the quiet dark of a Library of Congress. The careful handwriting of those Depression-era government workers has preserved what the modern encyclopedias quietly erased. The only question that remains is this: in a society that has universally agreed to forget, who will be brave enough to finally open those filing cabinets, read the faded ink, and uncover what the last witnesses actually remembered?